Val, I'm going to start with you. So the Secretary General, Wamkele Mene, he came to Washington to, of course, address an audience here, an event that, in fact, you and Frank co-hosted. Who came to hear Wamkele Mene speak here in Washington, and what did people want to know from him?
Yes, good question. The people that came were basically esteemed, stakeholders from public and private sector. We also had media represented. You were there, Heidi, so that was wonderful. We had high-level, trade policymakers and implementers present, and we also had ambassadors, African ambassadors primarily present. We also had a U.S. ambassador, Wisner, who was one of our, he made the introductory remarks, so that was wonderful. Yes, so basically that was it. It was a really wonderful event.
The Africa Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat says, Frank, economic integration is a process. And of course, experts are talking about a multi-decade process here. How long should we wait, or how long should it be before we can expect to see real results from this? And here I mean for ordinary people, for people who should most benefit from this, not just big corporations.
Right. Well, that's a good question. It does take a while. Basically, the agreement creates a customs union. If you think of the European Union, it's similar to that for Africa. So ultimately, tariffs will be removed, and more importantly, for the average person, tariffs and restrictions on services will be eliminated. So those folks who are in the business of providing services, whatever they might be, we'll see the benefits when the agreement comes into effect and removes those barriers.
Val, this free trade agreement promises to lift tens of millions of people out of extreme poverty. Do these kinds of free trade agreements really lift all boats? We know what a painful problem poverty is on the continent. And what are sort of the immediate challenges that you see that this economic bloc will have to overcome?
Well, very good question, really. The immediate challenges that they will need to overcome actually is addressing the problems or the plight of female and youth-owned SME traders. They comprise more than 79% of the workforce in Africa.
And so these are informal traders, right? Well, they've been working in the informal economy?
Well, basically the SME sector, they hire more than 79%, but you're right, more than 60% of that 79% are in the informal sector. Mm-hmm. So having to deal with questions about, the gaps in information, access to information, access to markets, access to capital is a big deal. The definition of SME within the OECD is very different from the definitions within Africa. And so most of our SMEs in Africa do not have collateral to be able to access capital. The bar is so high for them. Sometimes it's over 100,000, in terms of equity that they need to have to be able to qualify to have the
100,000 US dollars?
Yes, because the definition in Africa is totally different from OECD. OECD is to be an SME, especially on the M of the SME, you have to be a business that hires more than about 250. Africa has similar, but they also have revenues attached to it, right? Nigeria, don't quote me, 50 million naira, but you see, with inflation, it's really difficult for them to meet the bar. Most of my clients that are SMEs, female-owned SMEs, I work with, I'm the CEO of Afro-Cosmo Development Impact. I have survivalist clients and opportunist clients. The survivalist clients especially can't meet the demands that are expected of them with respect to the loans in terms of collateral.
Sometimes what is a survivalist client?
Yes, survivalist clients are clients who are not capitalizing on opportunities out there in the markets. They're surviving, they're living from hand to mouth. The informal trader, for instance, who's in the street, a street hawker, those are what I call survivalist clients. My company deals with food supply. In the food supply chain, we have farmers from cradle to grave. So the small-scale farmer The farmer who's probably not registered their business, or even if they have, they're surviving, they can't meet the requirements or in terms of eligibility requirements for getting loans. Those are basically survivalist clients, right? In terms of not just the size, but also their financial capital, how much they have in terms of assets versus liabilities. They basically have nothing. They're not capitalizing on opportunities out there like the cheetah generation, the African diaspora, technology, high-tech gurus, that are opportunist clients. We have some of those too, and in the creative industry, we have some of them, and the renewable industry, where they have a higher bar and they have more capital, they have more assets and stuff. So that's what we're basically talking about.
We're going to come a little later on to access to finance, because I really want to get to that as well. But Frank, I want to ask you first. There was one criticism of the North American Free Trade Agreement, or Nafta, which was this free trade zone for Mexico, Canada, and the United States. And one of the criticisms there, of course you're aware, was that this pact was essentially undercutting the bargaining power of American workers, because U.S. companies could simply relocate to Mexico, where it's cheaper, labor standards are different, and then sell back to the United States. And are these the same risks that we can expect in the African context?
Well, it's a little bit different with respect to the African agreement, because the differences in wages are not quite as striking as between, say, the United States and Mexico. So to the extent there's any dislocation in labor, it's going to be minimal based on the smaller differentiation in wages among African countries. Remember, this agreement doesn't directly cover the United States or Europe. It only covers African countries. And therefore, the barriers that are being removed are African barriers for intra-African trade. So things like wages, labor issues, are only going to be affected to the individual person based on the differences in wages between and among African nations.
And of course, we can expect that there might be resistance at home in these individual countries. I mean, the landscape is not the same in say, Nairobi as it is in Johannesburg. So what kind of resistance might we see, and from whom, especially as this free trade agreement begins to play out in very real terms in economies?
Well, the agreement has already been ratified, so the question of holding it up is really academic. It's not really going to happen. What you're going to see is possibly long-term some feeling that the benefits of open trade are not being spread equally among all sectors. So theoretically, an individual worker or a labor union may feel that because free trade is opening up markets, their interests are being jeopardized. That happens all the time with any free trade agreement, including NAFTA. So it's sort of an expected price you pay for having open and free trade.
Val, Wamkele Mene has said that Africa would be making a catastrophic mistake if we do not include women and young people in the implementation of this trade agreement. And here, of course, he points to young people, as you alluded to earlier as well, and women-run small and medium enterprises. But many of these very groups, of course, lack access to financing. Tell us a little bit about what you think needs to be done to ensure that this free trade zone is really inclusive and does offer opportunities for women, especially, to access financing.
Beyond access to financing, let me say, in terms of access to financing, I think especially for that clientele, in other words, the survivalist clients, the youth, female-owned SMEs. When we say SMEs, for your audience, small, medium enterprises, there's also the micro side. I think they need to diversify the scope of financing, the kinds of, or the nature of financing opportunities that are available to that demographic group. In other words, it needs to be beyond loans. Already, the good news is there's fintech, there's factoring. I'm not a finance expert, but to the extent that I know this, there's also grants being offered, there's equity, there's all kinds of opportunities out there that they should have, and also fringe benefits too should be available to them. I'm thinking in terms of street hawkers, offering them maybe subsidized, parking spaces, more hygienic spots, for them to be able to sell their products and all. So it's more than just loans, so to speak. Right now, the field is loaded with people who want to offer them loans. But there should be more, and of course there's fintech, there's factoring, but there needs to be more grants, there needs to be more creative financial mechanisms that, could be offered to them, right?
Does there need to be more education more education as well into what is available? I come from South Africa. Sometimes we talk about the wonderful laws and benefits that are available to people, but there isn't the same level of education and just sharing of information so people do know what their rights are or what they have access to or are entitled to.
Absolutely, Heidi. This is absolutely what we're doing. Frank and I work in this area of information gap, especially in the area of business, trade, legal knowledge, because we believe it's the bloodstream of access to finance, access to markets. You can have all the money you have or want. You can have all the markets, access to markets, but if you're not able to have information as to what is available in terms of where do you need to go, what are your rights and duties under those laws, forget about it. It won't happen. So basically, yes, there needs to be, in terms of filling up that gap as to, their inability to know where to go to fill out forms. My company, AfroCosmo, we run forums, and we had a session, I think, 2020, and the permanent secretary of the Ministry of Women and Social Services talked exactly about what you're saying. The women in the markets, especially in the informal sector, when COVID-19 hit, they were so concerned. They were wailing and screaming in the marketplaces. Most of them didn't even know where to go to access funds that were available for them. This is in Nigeria. So the issue of knowing where to go is also a big deal. The information gap is very critical. That's the intellectual capital is how I call it. Oftentimes undermined, but very, very critical in the process.
I'm so hopeful that will be really one good thing that comes out of it, is that people understand and are educated about the benefits that exist for them. Frank, what are the most important lessons here that Africa can glean from other free trade agreements? I'm thinking like Nafta or the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, which I find a little vague, or the European Free Trade Association. What are some of the do's and don'ts for Africa here?
Well, I think the big challenge for Africa is increasing visibility. There's not a great deal of recognition, certainly in the United States, but also within Africa, of what this agreement is and how it benefits individuals. So the institution has to do a lot of work in terms of explaining what the agreement is, how it benefits companies and individuals, and how people can take advantage of, for example, the financing options that Val mentioned. All of those require education because the agreement itself is just on paper. The real benefits come when there's execution of that agreement, which requires knowledge by interested parties. That's the biggest challenge.
Val, what's your take? What can Africa learn here, and what do you think are the most important things that the continent needs to avoid?
Basically, what they can learn from this is that, Rome wasn't built in a day, as His Excellency said at the meeting that we organized. Frank and I organized with Her Excellency Suka Mafutsi, the AU ambassador. And so it's going to take a bit of time for us to get there. And just to chorus what Frank said earlier, information gap is critical because the agreement cannot, the AfCFTA can never be fully implemented if people out there who are the beneficiaries and the stakeholders are not aware of it. And they're doing a good job so far with educating the masses, but it's going to take a while for us to get there. As I say, Rome wasn't built in a day, so we're going to do it. Definitely. I'm optimistic.
And there are masses indeed to educate. So a lot of work that lies ahead. Frank, final question to you. Wamkele Mene says, while the dream is, of course, for Africa to eventually be able to negotiate with the rest of the world as a regional bloc, this free trade pact will not affect any other really bilateral trade agreements that African countries might have in place with, say, trade partners outside of the continent. Now, with, of course, new market opportunities at African countries' disposal, what impact do you think this continental free trade zone will have on the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGOA, going forward, especially given that countries have had to meet pretty rigorous eligibility requirements with AGOA, and they've constantly had to defend their eligibility?
Right, that's a very good question. AGOA, as you know, expires in a couple of years, so it's important to coordinate that program with the AfCFTA. You may be aware that the United States has already begun negotiations for a free trade agreement with Kenya. It just started, it's a long way off, but I think it's a precursor to what's going to come. That is, the United States will offer its market open to African countries. And the real opportunity there is for all the members of the AfCFTA to join in a free trade agreement with the United States or with Europe or with Asia. That is where the benefits transcend Africa internally and promote external growth through increased exports. So long term, that's the best opportunity that I see.
How do we ensure that countries, that this agreement doesn't just benefit mainly countries like the economic giants, South Africa and Nigeria, and that smaller countries also get in on this pie, they get their piece as well? I know Wamkele Mene referred to manufacturing and the textile industries in places like Lesotho, for example. Very, very small country, probably needs this more than anyone. But if you look at South Africa, which traditionally does have monopolistic tendencies, if I was to put that lightly, how do we ensure that this really does have benefits for everyone?
Well, actually, that's a good example. South Africa does have a lot of barriers to trade within Africa, so they have committed to eliminate those. And when those barriers are eliminated, all other countries, including Lesotho and all the smaller African countries, will now have access to a giant market, which was essentially denied them because of South Africa's own internal policies. So it's a huge step forward for the bigger African countries to remove their barriers, and they do have a lot of them, that will inure to the benefit of the smaller African countries. That's really the long-term benefit these smaller countries will realize.
Val and Frank, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been really enlightening because, you know, we haven't really had this conversation about it. I mean, there's a lot of excitement around the free trade zone opening up, but really, as we look now at what's next. And so I thank you very much for your perspectives, and I thank you so much for your insights, and I thank you for the opportunity that you invited me so that I could actually do the interview with Wamkele Mene. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting us.